Welcome, everyone, to yet another episode of the War Report. And we got quite a bit to cover there. This has been an eventful past week or so, and even more so with what is on the horizons, because, of course, we have the coverage of the elephant in the room, I suppose we'll call it, just this early in the recording. I'm sure you all know what that gets down to. There's been some major on-the-ground activity, but there's also been some news in both the economic and political spheres as well, especially with the ruble and with Serbia and Hungary. And we can also look forward to what this weekend holds for France and what the next couple of weeks hold for France if their election does go into the second round. And this show did boldly predict that Macron would secure a handy victory. However, it does look like that rally around the flag effect upon the initial invasion has somewhat dampered. It looks like, although I wouldn't say the West has relented in its position on this war, they have become far less enthusiastic about it, both among the populace and the political class. So there is a lot to look into with that. But I suppose I know you're chomping at the bit, and I know you really want to take some time to put meticulous details in this, so I'll turn over the ground reports to you.
Well, I guess there's been two major developments on the ground. I'll have a more general analysis of what I think in Ukraine with reference to Russia. But there was another attack. I think everybody is aware of Bucha. And now you're even having some independent reports stating that there are no mass graves, and there are recordings even of uh, people wearing white bands who are shot on the street because they're looked at as Russian
All
sympathizers.
of which we denounce a
You kind of
conspiracy
saw
theory
this
because we do
madness.
respect the mainstream narrative. Let's be clear about that.
Yeah, that's right. But you saw this kind of madness in the first week where you had like regular people in Kiev started accusing other people of being saboteurs. But I mean, the definition of it as of a saboteur in Ukraine is like very loose. And you saw people getting beaten up for stealing a loaf of bread. Um, we've discussed on this show how economically strained things are there, and the war helped. So, um, what you have are people who, basically are scared, and some of them accepted food. The Russians had apparently dairy products, and they wanted some dry products. They exchanged them. The Russians even just handed out uh, ready-made food for them. These were found. There's photos of them. So basically, they executed them. And if anybody's been familiar with Ukraine, the kind of paranoia that there are traitors amongst them is so heightened. This is why they, in 2014, had to occupy cities like Mariupol, Kharkov, Slavyansk, uh, Kramatorsk, because they know all these cities are primarily Russian speaking, and they have had to be heavy handed. And this is the way they've maintained their rule. And it's not something that they have to worry about in the west of Ukraine, like far west, in Lvov. But in Kiev, there are still people who kind of wish the Russians, wouldn't, take over, essentially. And, as I mentioned on previous shows, after the coup in 2014, 1 million civil servants were just fired, right? They were all replaced with essentially loyal people, loyal to the regime. And this was looked at as that plus a heavy military presence in these cities is how they coped with any kind of insurgency or, attempts by civilians to break away. You can look at photos and videos of that time in 2014 in the spring, where citizens took over administration buildings in Yansk. That like this election was stolen from them. They had a foreign country that sponsored a coup, and they put people in power that would kill them, that would
I wonder where we
outlaw
heard
their
that exact
language,
same
which they
narrative 2 years later.
yeah, exactly. So, um, so there's been another attack besides Bucha, and this is in Kramatorsk. Now, Kramatorsk is interesting because this is going to be where probably the next huge battle is going to take place. Mariupol is finished. Uh, they liberated the port today, so the only thing left is the Ilyich factory and the Azovstal factory. These are two industrial sectors. Now, I was told the port had like 8 levels, and there was talk of even flooding it, right? Now, we should remember, because back in the day when there was fighting over the Donetsk airport, you know, there were the reason, part of the reason the fighting went on for so long, and Azov was sort of like, they were the last fighters in there. They fought for a week, literally, with like no, as far as I know, no sleep, probably next to no food, until they were finished off. And it had an underground walkway that went for several kilometers. So I don't know if something like that exists in Azovstal or the Ilyich plant, but they might. I would suppose that they do, because even the typical 5-story building in Ukraine and Russia has like basements to withstand bombing, right? So I'm going to assume these industrial areas have them as well, particularly because they were built, in the few decades that came or rejuvenated after the destruction of World War II. Be that as it may, there are now well less than 3,000, probably way less than that, of the last Azov fighters, volunteers, and probably also some Ukrainian Marines. There's an argument, some people believe the Ukrainian Marines are actually the better fighters if they're not as fanatical as Azov. Be that as it may, though, beginning Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, large portions of them began to give up. In Mariupol, one day there was 267 who gave up. The next day there were about 30. And I don't know what number there was today. It was a small number that gave up as well. So
Well, this is all very
there,
reminiscent of early 2014 with the initial breaks with the Donbass, with both forces defecting and just more or less surrendering or giving up and going home, where you'll recall with a lot of what happened, of course, with Crimea. Crimea was a taken over without firing a single shot. The Donbass,
yeah.
when the forces pushed through, I remember many troops, especially I believe it was actually among uh, the Marine ranks of the Ukrainian forces, where you had a lot of turncoats and defectors.
Yeah, there were, and part of the reason for that was the Ukrainian military was very small at that time, and the Azov battalion was formed in 2014, kind of as a reaction. Probably some of the founders who were, I think it was started in Odessa, if I'm not mistaken. I've heard some people say it was in Kharkov, but it, if it was Odessa, that was also where they rounded up 100 people who were sympathetic to the Russians, and they threw them in a building and they set the building on fire and burned them alive. And anybody who tried to get out was shot. Um, there's plenty of videos of that too. That in many ways cemented many of these towns to rebel against the coup in Kiev. So now, so this missile has with munitions, with like small munitions that exploded into several pieces, killed about 30 people and wounded at the very least 100 in Kramatorsk. And already on, like the Ukrainians aren't particularly bright, and I think when it comes to the media war, in some ways, like Zelensky is good at it, but the regulars are not. For instance, they mentioned that you know, Kramatorsk is garbage because the people there are sympathetic to Russia. Well, then, why then say that Russia fired this missile at them? Right? Obviously, these are mostly old people who want to get out of town and have no other way but to go by train at this point. Russia has not hit any train station, with the exception of this week, for the first time, hitting arms shipments that were coming into Ukraine from the West. But that's not the same thing as like targeting an area where people buy their tickets. So again, I doubt, the side that came up with Snake Island and Ghost of Kiev is lying again, because they're in partnership with the Empire of Lies. Now, I think for the general analysis, part of it is there to address certain things that people are saying in the dissident right. So as usual, the view around this war is highly myopic and often doesn't have a lot of depth, right? It certainly lacks a certain amount of metaphysical depth that it could have. And sometimes it just outright doesn't have even the depth required to understand like the larger scope of things. So what do I mean by this, right? So we've discussed several times that Russia went in with a small force. And obviously at the beginning, they expected that maybe there would be an immediate capitulation. Certainly they were not prepared for a huge invasion. But I think that doesn't mean they weren't confident that they would succeed. And it doesn't mean there is no other plan but this plan. That I strongly, strongly doubt. You're talking about a country that's been preparing for the last 8 years, and particularly the last 2, for this moment. I already stressed the metaphysical reasoning why they cannot destroy Kiev, right? You cannot have Putin do a speech for an hour long about how they're brothers, and then he's just going to carpet bomb them like they're Chechens. You can't do that.
No,
right?
You can't. Again, within the Russian cultural milieu, Kiev is still understood as the mother of all Russian cities. They can't do that to what is there. Again, depending on whether you believe in their mythology or not, what they perceive to be their point of origin.
Yeah. What we believe or think means nothing. It's all about what they believe, what
exactly.
they think, right? It doesn't mean like, people will see some historic communist flag from World War II and go, "Oh my God, they're communists." Like, if you listen to them, what they think communism is, or what they think fascism or Nazism is, it's not going to align with what you think as a Westerner. And they don't care what you think as a Westerner. It's not important to them. Anyhow, we've stressed this point before. So, they'll have like that flag, and they'll have an icon as well. So, like,
yes,
to the Westerner, that makes no sense. To them, it does.
I think it's the 93 showdown in front of the Russian parliament, where they have that along with the czarist black, yellow, and white flag just flying side by side.
That's right. And nobody thinks that's bizarre. Not really. So anyways, the other consideration that people haven't really thought about is, I think Russia knew China would stick by its side, but I don't think Russia was sure about everybody else. And the other question is, it's not over, right? Like, America's now in a very rapid and urgent way trying to pull away these countries that have aligned with Russia, right? Again, China and Iran, for sure, they're going to stick by. India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, they're not sure. So I think part of the soft approach was to appeal to them. think also that Russia has not destroyed like water filtration plants, internet services, electricity, gas for regular cars. Now, they have, of course, intensified because they have switched their strategy. When you look at the pullout from the Kiev region, for instance, they never increased the amount of people there. And at the end of March, Ukraine had no air force. They even began to run out completely of their drones. So really, their soldiers had never been safer than during the time that they pulled out. We'll get to Peskov, but I'm going to ignore what Peskov said about that was a goodwill gesture in order to build trust with the Ukrainians. I think that might be only partly true. Peskov has a more complicated role than that, and it's not very different than the role like Serbian nationalists play in the kind of dialectic that they form with Vucic. And we'll get to that. We discussed on the show before when Vucic made that trade deal that essentially benefits Serbia with Kosovo and allows Serbs to return back to Kosovo, right? So we'll get to that. So they basically pulled out when it had never been safer for them, when they were taking the least, not the most amount of casualties. The most amount of casualties happened in the first 2 weeks of March, not later on, right? So obviously it's not because they can't maintain it, but the next day, those troops arrived in the Kharkov region, right? And very soon after that, the Pentagon, Jake Sullivan, for instance, said that Russia is realigning its troops, and we believe that there's going to be a new theater in the east. Well, that's where the heaviest fighting has been taking place all along. The other thing to note is, I remember when Russia went in, they announced on the 21st, just before midnight, that they recognized Lugansk and Donetsk, and there were celebrations. And then, even before then, there was heavy shelling that was coming from the Ukrainians in a way I had not seen since 2014. And there began a rapid evacuation of people there. At the height, it was between 70 to 80,000 people were evacuated out of the Donetsk region. And Donetsk city. So what you have is a scenario where you're not going to deploy all your troops there. You're not going to commit all your troops into Ukraine. You have the largest country in the world, and you also have to be prepared for secondary country provocations. What if they decide to go into Transnistria? What if something really big happens in Syria? What if they cut off Kaliningrad? What happens if fighting? You have to have your military ready for that. What if they're crazy enough to go for a no-fly zone? All those things have to be considered. You cannot do this, especially if your plan is to sap away at the military resources of Ukraine rather than sit on it, right? Rather than get fully involved. That was, I think, the initial plan. And to that degree, they succeeded. Yes, with losses, but losses nonetheless smaller than that of Ukraine. But not insignificant losses. I want to stress that, right? So now what you have is Mariupol has fallen. And I think what Russia is hoping is those 60 to 70, some say even higher, thousand troops that are in the Donetsk region, right? The whole point of trying to pretend like you're going to take Odessa, and then you're going to take Kiev, and you're going to take Nikolaev and Kharkov. The whole point of that was to stop them, because like I said, the night that they entered into the Donetsk and Lugansk region, if they just formed a World War I line of contact, the one that already existed, and you're just going to push out from there. And you have to allocate a certain number of troops for all these other areas that you have to be concerned with. And at the same time, you're going to have the Ukrainians being able to supply everything they need to go to the front line, which is what the people in Lugansk and Donetsk had been living through
I
for
mean, although
eight
it's a crude
years.
analogy, it is a chess game. It is,
Yeah,
I move, you move, I move, you move, and they gauge each other's reactions
yeah,
based on that. And I do think people, again, have that very linear idea of warfare from, as you mentioned, the world wars, where it's, one big army meets other big army, they fight in open field or wherever they're at. Where, again, not that warfare has become that much more mobile, because that is, again, what I described, a very simplistic view of it, but
yeah.
but point being is, it is much more mobile than many of the wars we have seen in previous decades, and it is, again, it's a hybrid between a conventional third generation war, and that also bleeds into somewhat of a fourth generation war. You could that's how I would classify this conflict in my very informed and expert opinion.
Yeah, so now we said early on, and I mean, I can't confirm it, but it doesn't seem completely out of the ordinary. After the first 2 weeks of the war, I think some generals in the Ukrainian military caught on. Some of the officers, rather, caught on. And you had that story circulate that Pravi sector had gone into the east, somewhere southeast of Kharkov, and shot 4 officers who were suggesting to go to Kiev, right? From their point of view, right, like from the officers' point of view, they're sensing that this is going to turn into a cauldron. They might even have communicated with Russian generals saying, this is going to turn into a cauldron. Like, get your boys out of here. From the Ukrainian point of view, if we bring the fight to them in Donetsk, we can morally break them, right? But they never made an inch, and they have retreated from those lines, right? They have moved further west. So, those officers basically had the right idea. They knew what would eventually happen. And now I saw a figure like 98% of Mariupol now has cleaned up. What that allows is, instead of 30, 40,000 soldiers focused on 14 to 20,000 soldiers that are holed up in these areas, in a city that's about 500,000, they're free now, right? And the 40 or 50,000 that were around the west and east and north of Kiev, those are now moving into Kharkov, and they're going to also participate in the battles in Donetsk as well. The tragedy, of course, is that many of these more hardline guys, like in Azov, Aidar, C14, Pravi sector, that are embedded with the troops, is they won't let them, as much as they can, they won't let them give up. That is what's keeping them going. I'm not saying, I do think overall the troop quality of Ukraine from 8 years ago is vastly improved, and probably their morale also. We shouldn't forget that America from 2015 onwards was training 4 to 5 brigades every year for 7 years. For 7 years, constant training. So they got to the point of 35 brigades that are at NATO standard. So that's a morale booster. Okay. And I think many of them probably still believe that there is a chance.
And it's funny that you bring that up, because it is an interesting mirror to what Russia did to Syria over that same amount of time, in which case we saw much of the Syrian war really start to turn tides when you had the official Russian intervention, where these sort of actions ran parallel to each other, really showing what both were capable of. in terms of both smaller scale conflicts such as Donbass and Syria, all the way up until the most recent conflict where you have two. I wouldn't call them near peer, but I would say the Ukrainians. They punch pretty heavy for their weight, all things considered.
Yeah, yeah, and so there's lots of considerations, right? We spoke about the metaphysical, but we also spoke about how would, if Russia leveled Kiev the way they leveled Grozny, like how would that be received? How well could Saudi Arabia and India stand against pressure from the U.S., right? The problem with relying on like solely the military to understand what is happening in a theater of war is that they're focused solely, almost entirely on the military, right? And they're not focused on, let's say, what various political classes within the country might be up to. What kind of scheming might be going on. There are many, many, many considerations. And by the looks of it, Russia is going to step things up. They already have stepped things up. So now the Ukrainian military essentially has almost no mobility. DHL has given them some vans to move around on. I saw a video with 4 Ukrainian dudes on bicycles. These are soldiers I'm talking about. So they are interested in prolonging this war as long as possible. And I think even when you look at the execution and the torture of Russian POWs, that in a way was used so that Zelensky would not capitulate anything. And this brings me now to Peskov and Lavrov and the negotiations. So I personally don't think the negotiations are something to really take all that seriously. Because one, the Ukrainians were not going to bend early on. And in many ways, even those that wanted to were removed or eliminated. There was one of those guys who was part of the negotiation party who was killed. There was a mayor that was killed because he was suspected of being a traitor. This has been going on in Ukraine for 8 years. If they suspect you're a traitor, you're going to be beaten up, killed, thrown in prison. It depends. It depends on who catches you. And so I don't think there's any possible negotiation. And I think also that there's a belief that if Ukraine, quote unquote, loses, then America will step in. I think some of them are under this impression that that will happen. And I'm basing this on one of the members of Zelensky's public relations guy. His last name starts with A. I always forget it. I remember it after the show and then I forget it. But he described this. He's the guy who predicted in 2019 that there would be a major war sometime between 2020 and 2022. To get to the negotiations part, Lavrov basically let out that all the major concessions were admitted by the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians already reneged on them, either today or yesterday. So I wouldn't look at the negotiations that way. And the way I would look at Peskov is, as I said earlier, when I alluded to Vucic and his relationship with nationalist groups within Serbia, the execution of the POWs absolutely galvanized support from the Russian public, and it went from like 71% to 83%. And that's according to Levada, which is a Western polling company that's not a friend of Putin. much like the Moscow Times, which is a branch of the London Times.
Yes, and I also mentioned, I can't remember which it was. There was that one opinion firm out of Poland that more or less confirmed Putin's supposed popularity rate for these years, where it does seem that the wartime boost, the rally around the flag boost, has worked out greatly in his favor. Not that I ever think he was too particularly unpopular. Not that I think his approval rate fell even below, I would say probably about 60%. I would say, based
Yeah,
on what I've been given, based on my conversation with some of our Russian viewers and some Russians I do know, albeit online, I will fully admit that. That was about the right place to put it. That's where I felt it was. I always assumed they were a little fudged because every regime does what it can to make itself look better. But I didn't think that Putin's approval rating was like down in like the 30s or 40s or anything like that. But
yeah,
I will mention with that, the Russian political world has lost a larger than life figure in Vladimir Zhirinovsky. He unfortunately did pass away on, I believe it was Wednesday, April 6th. Now, he was noted
that
for,
was this one.
again, his more extravagant and boisterous personality. He was more of a show figure than an actual politician, despite the fact that
Yeah,
he was a normal third place contender in pretty much every presidential election since the fall of the Soviet Union. And of course, he's famed for the events such as going off on the Russian-Israeli dual citizen on primetime television, the throwing the water on his opponents.
yeah,
But despite being the so-called far right, and despite even his party being one of the more hubs of more, I would say, honest Putin opposition that isn't just people like Navalny, but like actual, I guess you could say, grassroots opposition to Russia, or at least disagreement with the current ruling principles, as it were. It did come, maybe not from Zhirinovsky himself, because Zhirinovsky was more or less on the same side of Putin. In fact, you could say he was sort of the A/B testing with Putin, who would push the narrative further, see how the public would react to that, whatever. But again, you'll recall those protests about 2 or 3 years ago in the east of Russia were uh, Ldp Protests, which were the Liberal Democratic Party. I do love that he called his party that. I thought that was very funny. But again, like that's been like I would say the most honest opposition to Putin has come from that sphere, if not Zhirinovsky himself, which does make me wonder what will happen because the LDP was something of I wouldn't go as far as to call it a personality cult, but it was a personal movement of Zhirinovsky. People supported the party because they support Zhirinovsky, not not they not that they support Zhirinovsky because they support the party. So it does make me wonder whether the party will just either fall to the wayside, dissipate, or take on a new form of, say, maybe a bit more of a, I wouldn't say opposition party, but a bit more of a skeptical party within the
hmm
internal Russian sphere, which I mean may be a good thing, maybe be a good thing for from the Russian point of view to put pressure on Putin from the right in order to push him. And again, I would also recommend that you read through the more recent works of Anatoly Karlin if you want to understand how the so-called nationalist turn Russia has taken in the past years. He does a really good job detailing that in his piece on
yeah,
Interview.
yeah.
Uh,
Carlin is amazing
yeah,
for that.
yes, he's probably one of my favorite people to reference on Russia, just because his work is so easily accessible and in the English language, and again isn't paused. But point being is, it does make me wonder if in his death, just on a side note, and I think this would be a more longer term thing, if perhaps a an actual alternative to Putin could arise that isn't again Navalny or the liberal empire's proxy
Yeah,
Russia,
that's
as it were.
those guys are out. That's over.
Yes.
That's over. They are finished. Essentially, with all the oligarchs leaving, and now the Google rep for Yandex leaving also to Israel. Funny, they all end up in Israel. Uh, that's over. They are now a fringe group. They're a very small number. Most of the people leaving Russia are those people, and Russia has a habit of like if you look at maybe the richest families in Italy, they've been the richest families in Italy since the Medici's. In Russia, the richest families they
They have a habit of
live
clearing house.
they have a clearinghouse about every 100 years, and this will be very similar to, what happened in many ways when Saddam Hussein took over, or when the Ayatollah took over. The middle class left, and basically what happened in both countries is a new middle class developed, right? But they owed their education from them, and something similar like that will happen in Russia as well. So this 31-year period, or 30-year period roughly, is over. That's finished with. And those people that fled, they know they cannot survive in Russia and maintain their opinions vocally. That's finished with. Particularly after what happened. Now, in some ways,
Yeah,
that
even
segues to
former
what I was going to
people
say
who I would
about
say
Peskov.
are on more friendly terms with Putin. For example, Abramovich, who was he was owner of one of the soccer clubs, actually in the West, as a matter of fact. He had a break-in with Putin over the outbreak of the invasion. So even ones who would have been considered friendlier or more in league with a lot of
I've
bridges
never
have been
believed that
burned.
about Abramovich
Now,
personally.
yeah, I'm not saying that they were like best friends or anything, but like at least publicly they were something of expedient allies. So even people who were like that have jumped ship.
Right, right. And and this is just before I get back to Peskov, I just wanted to say that Eric Stryker brought up something really interesting about Zhirinovsky. And, I know the whole, the J question around him, because he discovered late in life that he was part Jewish.
My
And
mother was a Russian, my father was a lawyer, to quote himself.
but there was that flirtation he had with the Zionist party. Then he was anti-Zionist and remained that way. And then in the 90s, he ended up coming to the U.S. and in the 90s on television said that white people have to stick together because they're being targeted. And it's amazing how salient that thing is, that statement from him turned out to be. Also, he predicted this war would happen this year. He's kind of like this guy who always had his ear to the rail, and he predicted a lot of things that came out to be true. And he turned out to be a real patriot for Russia. He turned out to be the real thing, much better than the ones that fled. And he deserves a Primakov Award. But let me just get to Peskov and what I think is happening with him. I think Peskov could very well be he could very well be the fall guy in this. That is, if you look at what Lavrov said, he's implying that Russia is going to stay in Ukraine for a longer period of time. This was always going to be like plan B if plan A didn't go. Also, by him looking like he's conceding, he has completely riled up. If you're on VK, he has completely riled up the Russian public. They're very well aware of their losses, which I'm sure now are definitely about 2,000 dead. And what he's sort of facilitating is expressing a point of view that is unacceptable. And what that does is now it puts Putin in, like, he's creating a kind of an informal referendum on what to do in Ukraine. And that puts Putin in a position that I think he does want to be in, where he will say, yes, we are going to stay longer. We're going to finish this. I could be all wrong, but I do not think that there is going to be a negotiation that is going to come out. There is no negotiation that the Ukrainians can give that is going to be satisfactory for the Russians. In fact, the Ukrainians have never been serious about any negotiations. They have only been a tactic, a stalling tactic, in order to buy more time. And I think this is why I say I don't take them seriously. And I'll eat my hat later. I'll admit to it, but I do not take them seriously. And I think this last row is kind of an example of it. This should be the latest example that this proves any kind of legitimacy in the negotiations. The West doesn't want it, so the next thing now will be a very, very major battle. It'll probably be bigger than Mariupol for sure, and you're going to see the West kind of lose their shit. Macron already hinted that just a few days after Jake Sullivan, made that announcement that Russia will now focus almost entirely in the east. Macron basically implied that this could be very bad. I forget his exact words, but he echoed what Sullivan had said, but he hinted that this could be a very sad and disastrous moment.
However, very sad and disastrous moment for the political career of the Jupiterian president.
Yeah.
We'll get into the French election news a little bit here. I just want to tease that a little.
Yeah, that's right. But I think there are not just politicians, but forces in the West. I don't think they can tolerate another defeat. I don't think they can tolerate another humiliation after Afghanistan.
Well, I do think we did say
that was a small humiliation. This would be a very big humiliation.
We did say this at the beginning of the war. Both sides have put everything they have in this. They have both bet everything on this. So it is of the utmost importance to come out at least being perceived as the winner at the end of the day. So
yeah,
the West will pull whatever propaganda PR campaigns. They'll pretty much do everything except actually lifting a finger, which I'm not trying to go Biden or Macron or any of these people that actually put boots on the ground. No, absolutely not. But point being is, they will do everything shy of any actual substantial action in order to be the at least optical victors of this conflict, even if they don't particularly win. Which is why you notice the media has been quiet, because there is less they can toy around with, even with all the criticisms, both legitimate and otherwise, of the Russian performance in the war. However, I would say probably the most legitimate criticism you could give to the Russian criticism is I think they thought Ukraine would be much more amicable to an arriving Russian force, that they would, they didn't exactly fall into the trap that Americans did with Iraq, where we'll be greeted as liberators, but I do think there was an element of that at play. They thought the Ukrainians would be much more receptive to Russian rule returning to that land after, of course, just a few decades, and that's how much you want to consider the Soviet Union as a Russian-led polity, but that's aside this point here. But point being is that that's probably the biggest criticism you could give, and I also do think that insofar as the West is concerned with Western strategists, they thought that all the money and the resources that they've sunk into Ukraine, that Russia would take much more of a beating, that Russia would have actually taken the kind of losses that we've been propagandized to believe they have already taken.
Right, and I mean, I do think maybe some generals believe that was possible. You hear about these FSB reports, but I'm not so sure how much I buy that. I think going in soft, you could look at that as a kind of a goodwill action on the part of the Russians to test the waters, very much the way they probed to see which cities were maybe more amicable than others. But I think the larger global concerns, and again, to return to the point when people comment on Strelkov, Strelkov had to be, I believe, had to be rescued either from Kharkov or from Slavyansk, and it was Motorola and his Sparta battalion that rescued him. And he was one of those guys who thought they could go to Kiev, right? And so some of these guys, while they're very good on the battlefield, can underestimate certain things. And Russia was not sanction proof in 2014 for the kind of sanctions that possibly would have been levied at them if
Yes, and
they
I think
had
you do have to
decided
remember that.
to go for everything in 2014. China was not prepared for them. So this is something that had to be developed over a protracted period of time. And I don't believe that the soft approach has only one reason why it was.
Yes,
But the
I would
soft
agree.
approach is steadily withering away. Like I think part of the reason this is just a guess. Part of the reason why they still keep the internet going in Ukraine is because they want to eventually capture Zelensky and maybe make some show out of it. Now, how they're going to do that, I think that's done. Again, this is just speculation on my part. I don't know at all, really. It's just speculation. What I will say is, tentatively, June is when they begin their court proceedings for like the captured, Nazis of Ukraine. So that will be quite something, right? And Russia's economy actually isn't doing too badly.
Yes, and the
Uh,
ruble is actually, as we mentioned, actually up from what it was before the invasion. But one last thing I will touch on with the actual military performance is something you need to remember not only about Russian military officers, but uh, pretty much every military in the world that isn't, say, Syria or, again, forces in Yemen or forces that have actually experienced a total war uh, before this point is a lot of these officers, especially the great powers, you think the U.S., Russia, China, a lot of it has been just boardroom meetings and speculations and talking about it and looking at numbers on a screen and pieces on a table, where that's a bit of an antiquated way to look at it, but point being is they have dealt with this from a far away view by and large that many of them have not seen on the ground war uh, since they were either starting their career or if at all.
mhm,
And
mhm.
it becomes easy to become skewed when you look at wars like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, etc. These very irregular wars, and then apply that to two actual states with actual military forces going head to head, where even if not consciously, you see how miscalculations are made just because of the way that they have been operating in their day to day life, in their professional career for the past 3 decades.
Yeah, yeah. Like again, I'm not saying the soft approach hasn't cost them. It's cost them dearly, but it has not cost them as much.
Yes, and again,
And
I'm just putting that as general qualifier as to
yeah,
because again, a lot of people like to play armchair general, myself included, and again, you have to realize that uh, every war is different. Every war is so dynamically different that you have to take a look at every little individual detail like that, and you will always overlook something, and that
yeah.
no matter how great of a strategist or tactician you are, again, you can't read the enemy's mind.
Right. And I think also it has to be noted now it's certain 6 weeks in, we know which countries are going to be firmly on Russia's side. So if Russia, they've galvanized around it. So now Russia knows uh, better who they can count on than let's say the first 3 weeks, who they can count on, what the West probably will and won't do. And so if they want to go harder, resolve will continue to stay with this core that's developing. And that can only happen with something over time. It's not knowable right away.
But with that being said, we went on just a touch longer than I expected with that, getting into some of this election news because
Mm.
it was really something. So I'll start out with the less significant one, but I would say more odd one, which was Serbia, where Vucic was reelected as president of Serbia. However, his party did lose seats, but it wasn't to, for example, uh, say other traditional opposition parties. It was more so from splinter groups from with his own party that formed their own parties and coalitions against him. So if you look at the so-called left-right divide in Serbia, the right won the day. However, they are more fractured than what they were. And Vucic did have some odd moves immediately upon winning the election. For example, he did vote to remove Russia from the very important UN Human Rights Council because we all know the power and the authority of the UN. And again, like honestly, in
I
so
mean, even Trump removed America from the Human Rights
yeah,
Council.
like insofar as that's concerned, like if they want, like if they're putting weight on Serbia, like oh you must condemn Russia, you must punish Russia somehow. That's probably like the easiest thing you can do is remove them from these superfluous UN councils that have no power or influence over anything. Because if you hadn't gotten it by now, I think if this past war shows anything, the UN has always been a toothless organization. They're only good for the individual machinations. I'm sure you all know these stories about the blue helmets that I will not share to spare you the details. But again, the UN was never to be this global forum that it was sold to us as, and that was sold to
Yeah,
the people as 70 years ago. It was it was a room for these people to again smugly pontificate on some abstract global order that some of them believe and others much more realistically don't believe would come to fruition someday, just so they can get up there once a year every September and lecture the world about whatever their pet issue is. Or I remember Obama's UN speeches were some that is some of the most smug and arrogant one of the most smug and arrogant speeches I've ever heard. Like you can go on about Trump's ego all day, but like at the end of the
yeah,
day, it's like he's a self-aggrandizing celebrity billionaire. But like listening to the way like that your traditional Western head of state or that UN officials talk at the UN General Assembly, it makes Trump look like a humble beggar. If I'm being completely honest. But
oh yeah,
with that all being said, it, it's a very easy condemnation to remove them from these very superfluous and toothless international organizations that really the only reason you stay in there is to maintain prestige with the West, which we all have seen with the past 8 years and with this decision to actually initiate this. That prestige with the West was no longer a concern of Russia when they initiated this war or when they responded to the actions that initiated this war. Whatever. That's getting into minutia there. But point being is, upon
yeah,
the outbreak of this conflict, I'll just leave it at that for quote unquote neutrality's sake. Whatever. But point being is, although you had that, you haven't had any significant sanctions against Serbia. There is immense pressure on Serbia, even after the election of Vucic, in order for them to cooperate with the ongoing sanctions regime. Although we can all see how faithful the West is about that because even reports are that U.S. import of Russian oil is up 40%. So if sanctions have been wavered, and you may have noticed gas prices went down about 10 or 20 cents nationally, based on the figures I had checked. So, and then of course you have Germany waffling back and forth on whether they want to waiver certain energy restrictions, and several other European countries as well taking that same line. So a very unified front. Once again, to clarify, NATO has never been more united on any issue ever. But
yeah. You
with
just need to be reminded. But Vucic actually came out and said that he voted against Russia in the voted yes to oust Russia from the human rights group or whatever um, because of extreme pressure. So Vucic is very good at pretending that he's actually interested in joining the EU.
yeah, I mean
Um,
Vucic. Like I remember a few years back, I think it was 2019. There was a show I called him spineless, but he's actually a very skilled. You could
yeah,
almost say manipulator in terms of that, where he will comply with like almost every command the West gives him, but just does the bare minimum and just does shy of enough in order to appease them in order to stay within the good graces of Russia. I mean, he is great at walking a tightrope. You could almost say that he is the inverse of Erdogan, whereas Erdogan is very boisterous about it, where he's very theatrical about flaunting his relationship with either the West or Russia at that time. Vucic is very calm and reserved about it, so it is almost like that. And of course, we'll get into Hungary and Orban later if you want to continue on that certain dynamic. But I guess it's just that Balkans down into Anatolia sort of political strategy that's been spreading that started in Hungary, I suppose, and even has been stretching a little bit up north. You saw Lukashenko tried to employ that, but it's becoming a more and more popular diplomacy tactic of these secondary and tertiary nations because they realize the American empire, while it is on the backslide, it will be more amenable to these wishy-washy powers, to these countries that want to really, again, walk that tightrope and have a foot in each camp. So I think we'll see, especially in Europe, especially in the Middle East, those two areas in particular, these secondary and tertiary nations start to play the the Orban card or the Erdogan card, whoever you feel is more appropriate to name it after.
Right, and the party that got a lot more seats this time around is a right-wing nationalist party in Serbia, and for the first time they beat out like the liberal camp. So, in many ways, you could, in some ways, let me preface that correctly. In some ways, you could see that in Serbia, it's a flip. Like Peskov has this role of being like the spineless guy, and that's in order for Putin to get the people's mandate to do the opposite of what Peskov is suggesting, right? And in Serbia, it's kind of the reverse. Vucic is like the Peskov, and it's the nationalists that push him, put pressure on him, quote unquote, in order for him to do the right thing. He's ultimately the one that knows what Serbia can and can't do given its power, right? I believe it's a country of 8 or 9 million. It's not. It cannot wield that kind of power in the world order of values.
You know, one
right?
thing I will
even,
say in terms of that, it is almost amazing, and perhaps it is because it's out of necessity, as you described with Serbia's situation just there, that you have more intelligent internal political maneuvers by people like Vucic and Peskov, and I suppose Peskov maybe isn't a good example because Russia is a major player on the world, but again, Vucic, and you could even stretch to Hungary with Orban, but that the leaders of these very small countries have more political savviness, at least in an internal sense, than most Western politicians at this point.
right, because they don't have the amount of power and hubris that they do, that the politicians in the West do, right? There's nobody that's going to, like, in many situations, there's no one that can back them up. And it's only a limited amount of support that they can give, right? So they have to play their cards wisely. It's just like Russia could not have done the kind of things that it's doing now 20 years ago, right? If you don't understand that, if you don't understand, the world of politics is also the world of the possible, like, you're never going to get it, right? Making purity arguments is really for a kind of very two-dimensional concept of politics and ideology.
Yes, and I forgive me if this
There's
comes off or if this makes any of you cringe, but I do think people forget, like many things, politics is very metaphysical. It's about often more times what you cannot see rather than what you can see, or what is possible than what is real.
right, and you have to be judicious. You have to pick your battles, and you have to. Sometimes you have to wait for the opportune moment. There are plans within plans, and you have, if you're a smaller country, this is your lot. That's how you survive. There are no options. You will have to side with big powers, and if the big power that you're siding with is weaker than the other big power, then you're going to have to get creative. But Vucic will never be he will never put Serbia in NATO, and he will continue to tease the EU. I'm very sure the EU knows that Vucic will not even think about joining the EU. He will say so. He will, even shortly after his victory, he talked about path to the EU. But I don't believe it. I just simply don't believe it. Now, Orban is in a different position. But before I monopolize anymore, why don't you talk more about the elections, and perhaps if you're not done with the Serbian election, maybe move to the Hungarian election.
Well, one last thing I'll say about Serbia is, once again, they are a vital country to keep your eye on, because they will become, and arguably have already become, the go-between with Western countries that are more amicable to cooperation with Russia, and European countries, EU countries in general, that are more amicable towards cooperation with Russia. and Russia itself, because again, Serbia is still walking that line and playing coy with the EU, saying, I think we'll join one day. I think we're on a path to membership if you'll have us, and just play this constant back and forth with the Eurocrats, while at the same time being Serbia and being where they are historically for the past several centuries, if not, if you want to go back even further, is, of course, very much within the good graces of not only the current Russian regime, but Russia as a people, a culture, and a civilization, because of those ties that run back so far and so deep, where we already see with the flights alone that they've become a point of circumvention, and I can only imagine those efforts will continue, especially with the current ongoings in Hungary, and with even the burgeoning relationship between Hungary and Serbia. And I'll again won't tease you anymore, because I'm sure you all want to hear takes about Orban, which I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear that we're very happy to hear that him and his Fidesz coalition, which includes, of course, the main party and the other various parties that get scraped together, control roughly 2/3 of Hungary, in which case that gives them the authority to pass constitutional amendments with
Yeah.
no, that's assuming there's in-party loyalty, which it does look like that within the party they are pretty cohesive, so it wouldn't be much infighting. You had the referendums on the LGBTQ CIA education. You had that struck down, like affirming that that shouldn't be taught in the schools by about 93%. And just once again, you have the crackdown where it's showing not to be the big defender of democracy, because you guys know our opinions on democracy, but point being is to really play within the contradiction of the narrative. The very popularly elected leader and his party and his supporters is something of, I can't remember the exact word you described. I think it was something along the lines of a mob rule as opposed to actual democracy, because the liberal principles didn't win the day, and at this point it still maintains that Javik is the largest opposition party, where they are allegedly the party that is further right to Fidesz. However, they're in the coalition with the more mainstream left and liberal parties, all the way to like the further left Green Party and socialistic parties, where it's actually exactly like the situation in Israel, where Bennett, the leader of the so-called far right, like hardline Zionist party, was able to come to a coalition by making a deal with the liberal centrists and left-wingers, because that was their... They all had that much of a vendetta against Netanyahu that they wanted to see him gone, and you had a similar case like with that in Hungary, but unlike Netanyahu and unlike the Zionist state, Orban did prevail. And now you have alleged reports that they found destroyed or partially destroyed ballot boxes that were dumped on the Romanian border. Again, just whatever. But point being is, Hungary, even facing down the accusations of being pro-Russian, that was the main line of attack against Orban throughout this campaign, was he will sell our country out to Putin, blah, 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 blah. And with all of that, with the ongoing EU pressure on Hungary, with the sanctions, whether that be over their internal laws, and you saw something similar with Poland, or their cooperation with, let's just say, the illiberal powers of the world, at the end of the day, they still prevailed. The Hungarian people overwhelmingly wanted somebody like Orban, somebody who would take the country in the direction that Orban would try to remain in power. And with that being said, I can only expect there to be more scrutiny on Hungary, because although they are a small nation of only, I think they're also in that range of just shy of 10 million, same with, say, the Serbs.
Mm-hmm.
But point being is, although they, as an individual landlocked country, may not be that significant, the example they set and what they inspire could spread into much more consequential players, which we'll get into when we once again discuss the much teased French election discussion. But point being is, you already have this loose coalition of European populist and nationalist leaders who are saying, although we believe in sovereignty and our individual cultures, that doesn't mean that European cooperation should be completely forsaken. We just, and I believe it was actually, once again, and I promise I will get to the French election soon, it was Le Pen saying we need an alliance of sovereign nations to replace the EU, or maybe it was, yeah, it was one of the Le Pens that said that, wanting to use the powers of the French presidency to restructure the EU into something much more amenable to, say, more nationalistic or traditional or whatever ideas. But Orban has secured victory. The media outrage is not as severe as I would have expected. Perhaps they have learned either A, not to give it attention because that draws the attention of people who wouldn't
Mm.
have normally otherwise said it. Because, I mean, you talk to your average MAGA boomer, once you chip away some of the programming, they'll hear about a guy who wants to put his country first. They'll think like, oh, like they have a Trump too. It's a very like grossly simplified way of thinking about it. But in terms of an average person who follows politics only tangentially, if not at all, it is enough to say give them the wrong ideas from the liberal elite point of view.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I'm also seeing like nearly comical depictions of Macron, and a kind of like suggesting that all those you know those French, they're never happy with anybody, is a kind of an explainer for why Macron is doing so good right now, which is honestly not anything I could have ever expected. But but yeah, Orban has won a resounding victory, and the thing with them is they will use the trope that he's a Putin puppet, mainly because he's not on board with their agenda. Um, Hungary could be a country on Mars, and if it had the with the same, if it had the same, uh, let's say, political ideology that it has now, it too would be considered a Putin puppet state, right? That is what irks them,
Look,
right?
and I'm
Is
not
that
saying Poland gets off scot-free or anything, but
yeah.
they get much less scrutiny because they're willing to toe the line on certain issues, that they are willing to pay for their nationalistic policies with also a very pro-NATO policy, or anti-Russia policy, if you will. Whereas Hungarians, while you may pull them, they may, talk the talk. At the end of the day, they don't walk the walk, especially in the leadership.
Hmm.
And it's
Yep.
it's funny enough because you read at least the stated positions of a party like Jobbik, they are also in favor of Orban's foreign policy regarding Russia and the European Union. So at the end of the day, the distinction between Jobbik and Fidesz is actually just very nitpicky, and I mean, I would probably chalk it up to a difference in just a personality feud where I'm not even sure who the current leader of Jobbik is, but they dislike Orban because of X, Y, or Z personal reason rather than anything actually related to policy, or they feel he's inadequate on whatever pet issue they may point out, or perhaps he's too friendly with Israel, or just a myriad of these different issues here. But with all that being said,
Yeah.
you do have a resounding victory with that. When it seemed for a time, for a few years there, with the collapse of the Conte Salvini government, that the so-called populist wave was in a something of a retreat, and as Brexit stalled out, and as a few of these more populistic figures and ideas didn't get the support one would have expected them to based on 2017, 2018, Orban still remains strong. Hungary still remains that epicenter of really this new idea of governance and new idea of European identity, or I suppose you could say revival idea of European identity, because in some ways it's very revolutionary, in other ways it's also very traditional, where it doesn't seem like, again, despite Orban's comments and despite some of the pictures he's posted, I doubt he has this great irredentist feud, say, against Slovakia or Romania. I doubt he wants to focus Hungary's national efforts on feuds with nations like that, but rather it has the idea of wanting to build something of a civilizational bloc, which, again, that is very revolutionary. That is, if you were to take that in a vacuum, the same idea as the Eurocrats. However, that is also coupled with this very traditional idea of European civilization as this very homogenous thing with these certain values, with these certain religious beliefs, etc., where, again, I believe they fear that perfect storm coming out of Hungary where even if it isn't able to be exactly replicated, it serves as much more inspiration than they are comfortable with spreading to even just other small
Yes.
European countries.
It's very much like what we said about Trump, that although there was precious little achievement of anything at all, um, and in the end he capitulated. That is the way he handled the riots in 2020, and to this day still goes on about, maybe my greatest achievement was coming out with this vaccine so
Yeah,
quickly,
yeah. He sings the
like he
praises
was in
of
the lab or
Operation Warp
something.
Speed, and again, he was talking about how, like, I would have done it better and blah blah blah. But point being is, and that's for somebody who has very little accomplishments to his name as compared to Orban, who actually has a record of success he can point to in the past few years.
Right, right. Again, it's the rhetoric, right? It's the rhetoric that counts. Um, it, in these early stages, I have to keep reiterating that these are early stages, and you can kind of see how um, upset it makes them, right? Um, a lot of people will purity spiral about Orban, the way he handled COVID, which was not admirable. The way he had a good relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, but you have to strategize over many years. And Orban, this is his fourth election, and he's going to be really tested in this term that he's just embarked upon. So you don't get here quickly and all at once by being a purist. You have to do it gradually. You have to know how much power you actually have.
Yes, it is working within the system insofar as the tools exist, which I would say in somewhere like Hungary, even though it is a much smaller, less influential nation, those tools are more readily available than in many Western nations. But speaking of Western nations, we will move on to, I suppose one could call it the bellwether of Europe, at least in a historical sense, which is
Mm-hmm.
France. Now, their elections will be on April 10th, which by the time this premieres will be tomorrow. And although Macron does hold the lead, it is just barely going into the first round. It is pretty tough competition. People are expecting a repeat of what we saw 5 years ago between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, even though the polling for Le Pen and Macron is much more narrow than it was in 2017, and also much more narrow than the actual 2017 results, where Macron won I think it was about a 65% victory, just about 2/3 of the vote, overcoming Le Pen. But of course, this election you have Zemmour, which you could argue is used to split the right wing vote in the preliminary election in the first round of elections, which I would contend. I think Zemmour has said some good things, but I think in terms of steadfastness, in terms of track record, although I wouldn't agree with quite a bit of what Marine Le Pen says, I think she is one of the weaker elements within the French right wing sphere, from my knowledge of it at least, has been much more steadfast, has a proven track record of the principles she has advocated for. Whereas Zemmour, I'm not saying he was a nobody, but in terms of his run for president, did appear from relative nowhere. But again, it it can be assumed whichever one loses will support the other because, according to the polling, it's either going to be Le Pen or Zemmour. Now, there are some polls that give Mélenchon, who is a more socialist candidate, numbers, but I don't foresee that. I think it's either going to be I think the battle in Europe will be either the centrists or the right, is what it comes down to, and the idea of some of these left-wing coalitions is starting to rapidly dissipate, where you're either a neoliberal or you're far right, is the dichotomy they created for us, which I do think will be
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
a dichotomy that right-wingers, for better or for worse, will play into. But
Yes.
although we said about a month ago upon the outbreak of the war that Macron had more or less secured victory with a rally around the flag effect, it does look like his numbers have wavered in that sense. It does look like that his leadership, and you could chalk that up to some COVID restrictions, you could chalk that up to, say, his reaction to the crisis in Ukraine, whether people think he's been too hard or too soft. Worth keeping in mind that even up until a couple days ago, Le Pen was making statements on how France should leave NATO, so you have that as well. But point being is, it is going to be a much more contentious election than the last time, and then that's on top of the current political climate in France, which is there's always a certain degree of instability in France that doesn't exist within the Anglosphere, at least in the modern paradigm, in my opinion. You could point to something like the Yellow Vests, or you could even point to some of the more recent pushback or debate over the COVID restrictions, whether it be the lockdowns, the you know what mandates, etc. But point being is, what I would have thought was a shoehorn for Macron mere weeks ago is looking to be a much more foggy prospect than I would have initially foreseen. And even before the outbreak of the war, I predicted Macron would probably find a way
Yeah.
to eke it out. I thought it was going to be a contentious election. So I am back to my initial prediction pre-war that Macron wins by the skin of his teeth, but I would not be surprised if he is ousted.
I know. And then what happens? Uh, I mean, that would be like let's forecast um, third week, fourth week of April. When is their second round, by the way? Just
It's I think 2 weeks after. I think it would be the 24th.
24th. Okay, so near the end of April, let's say the Russians are taking more and more villages, as they have been in the Donbass region, and Le Pen wins. I mean, it's a disaster. I mean, Newland is going around all over the world trying to get as many weapons as possible to send you to Ukraine. Now, this is, of course, a media stunt, right? Like, I hope people see through that. It's there to buoy up
I'll be
the
honest, this is the
morale
first I've
of
actually heard of it, which shows how effective it is.
yeah, but it's just there to garner support and more, especially morale for the Ukrainians, but particularly for the West, that they're doing something. And I mean, the amount is pretty measly so far. Slovakia gave its only air defense system, which was one unit of the S-300. Like, anyways, how they're going to get to East Ukraine now that that area is almost entirely encircled, I don't know. And Russia now does not have air supremacy. It has complete dominance of the air over Ukraine now. Uh, so it's going to be taken out. Most of them are going to be taken out before they get there. Anyhow, um, you can imagine the perfect storm for them if Macron wins, uh, and you know you have something like either like massive deaths on the Ukrainian side in East Ukraine, and or you know, mass surrender.
Well, I think
Uh,
speaking of massive amounts of things, we can expect this election to have massive amounts of poppycock. I mean, just looking at the most recent U.S. election, there's no way they're going to allow this to be, let's just say, a uneventful affair. And I'm sure there will be CIA or State Department or some sort of American imperial fingerprints all over this most recent thing. The question is, will it be enough to maintain the status quo? Because it is an interesting reversal of some of these color revolutions where it's usually toppling the status quo is the goal of the whatever agency or department or bureaucracy has been assigned to that particular country. But it turns out in France the case here would be defending the status quo, and the question is, will they be able to successfully do that? And I'll be honest, I actually don't know. While I still do predict Macron wins by the skin of his teeth, whether by legitimate means or otherwise, I really couldn't tell you how exactly this is going to play out, and I would be not surprising the slightest if the opposition does pull it off and Macron is removed. And maybe I'm speaking from personal bias there, but anything's possible this election.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, the one thing I'm afraid of is if things, go badly, continue to go badly, because Russia's not crumbling. The economy is actually okay. There are more countries supporting Russia than was initially anticipated.
And not to mention the
Um,
West's wavering resolve, for example, such as the oil sanctions waiver, which having U.S. imports of oil up and Germany constantly waffling. So even the so-called steadfast countries, you're starting to see cracks in the dam.
right, right, and you know these people cannot they cannot back down. There's no reverse, and I don't know what they're going to do. That's what I find scary about them. Um, Now the rhetoric is that they are, you know, going to make this a long war. Even Burrell said that we'll never stop arming Ukraine because we don't intend on losing this war. But honestly, in the next 4 weeks or next 3 weeks, um, they might have to force themselves to do something more, and I think that's really what's kind of scary. Now, I know when America pulled out of Afghanistan, I believe the Atlantic still had you know still had people saying that uh, the Taliban wasn't going to take over, and 2 days later they did, and so I don't know. Are they going to let it go like Afghanistan? It doesn't seem likely. This is really the big enchilada. This is it.
Well,
Um,
it quite literally is the make or break where they are either going to have they're going to either go apeshit over this to not mince any words, or it's going to be the complete break in morale where they just throw up their hands and we can be assured that the empire will be soon in whatever form that may take. And again, it's a complete crapshoot as to which would be the case. Perhaps it will appear to be one at first, but then the other, perhaps they will want to come in strong but realize that they simply cannot. Perhaps they will try to maintain their cool but then completely snap. But with that, point being is this is going to be something that either makes or breaks the current global order. And you could argue the current global order is even destroyed as it is, but in more particular terms, it's going to be something that makes or breaks the American empire for the rest of the 21st century. And I say that unequivocally. This is probably the moment we're coming up to right here. Just this entire series of stories over the past month and a half, starting with the actual outbreak of the war, through the French elections, through whatever machinations will occur later this year, 2022 will be the year that decides the rest of the course of the 21st century, unequivocally.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's and you can see what I mean. Like, if they really do go crazy with um, an inevitable and very obvious looming Russian victory, right? You can see why Russia cannot afford to have all its troops in one area because you don't know where the attack could come from, where the provocation could come from. I mean, I've seen some stuff on Western media saying, "That's it, we cut off Kaliningrad. We put an embargo in Kaliningrad." And about 6 months ago, there was that YouTube channel, Good Times, Bad Times, which just very pro Poland, very anti Russia, that literally came up with the scenario that for some reason the Russians couldn't get to Kaliningrad, but they don't explain what reason that is.
Wait,
And
so we're
I'm
expected
very
to
sure that
believe that in the 1950s, American empire was capable of doing an airdrop of supplies into West Berlin under extraordinary circumstances but the Russians haven't budgeted a plan for Kaliningrad that would involve some sort of airdrop of supplies, even if we just want to take, a exact example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, the narrative coming out of this, I know it's been, we've, treated this like a dead horse, but it's this strange idea that a lot of people have in mind, whether consciously or subconsciously, that Russia didn't think of what the backlash of this might be, that they didn't think that there would be consequence for that, that they didn't budget for the idea that there would be economic consequences, that Kaliningrad uh, maybe used as leverage, or access to Kaliningrad maybe used as leverage.
Or Transnistria. They would walk
Yes,
over Transnistria in
yeah.
no time.
It's like they expect us to believe that Putin is this mastermind who can orchestrate the entire global right wing and put Trump in power and create Brexit, but him and his strategists can't budget for an exclave of their country.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
It really is a self-defeating narrative. It's like, is Putin the evil genius, or is he completely incompetent? If he's completely incompetent, why are we so worried? It's again, it goes around in circles. Not that you expect consistency from these people. They want to subconsciously ingrain both in your mind, so you both get scared and overconfident. But
That's a
again,
good point.
it's this constant like dueling narratives they have that if you just take even just 10 minutes to think about it, you could see through most of it.
Yeah.
Well, that's all I had for this show, unless you have any last minute surprise stories.
I will say one thing. As far as the Middle East goes, there have been a series of attacks in Israel, and another one occurred yesterday where like gunmen are just going around and just basically executing people. And there, the first two attacks were committed by Israeli Arabs, and the other bit of news, because I think it ties into it, is there was a rocket attack on an American armored personnel carrier, heavy damage from what I saw, and four American troops were injured. I'm going to presume, based on the damage, some of them were probably seriously injured. And it looks like the group that did it is uh, like a Shia group based in Iraq, but they had gone over to the Syrian side. That's where the attack took place.
Ah, yes, just
And
traveling around the entirety of the crescent.
right, right. So I guess what I'm getting at is I think there are a lot of groups that are sensing weakness, and they're going for it. I would not be surprised for a another war, another kind of a roundup of forces that we saw last year that took place in May. I think there's a strong possibility that could happen again.
Well, I haven't definitively declared it, but I think it's been quite evident for some time that Iran has a very solid grasp over the Shia Crescent, which has been what we what the American Empire had been trying to prevent for years. And honestly,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that was the entire point of the JCPOA, was to pacify them to the point where they would want to play along with the current global order. But at this point, after 5 years of Trump and Biden, Iran is in the best position it's ever been in recent history, you could say. I would say even better than, say, even the days of when the Shah was in charge, because although they did have the economic prosperity, the westernization, in terms of actual political and geopolitical influence, it wasn't non-existent, but was stunted by its association with the American Empire at the very least. And
Mm-hmm.
again, Iran, whether that be directly or via proxies, is within striking distance of major Zionist cities. So, insofar as that front, they have won. You've noticed that Israel has calmed down quite a bit in the past 4 years. Ever since I think they realized that, despite Trump's rhetoric, despite Trump's aid packages or whatever he's going to do for them, and then especially followed up by Biden, that they didn't have that steadfast friend in Washington that they've had since 2001. Now, I will reiterate once again, I have no doubt that Israel will continue to get what it needs as long as we're able to provide it, but the era, that 20-year era of Israel getting what it wants, is gone.
Yeah, I think it's been said by many others. America kind of as a military sport is a military power uh, has been spent, particularly in the Middle East already, with what they wanted to accomplish in Syria and Iraq. Um, it hasn't worked out, and I think Israel is aware that they can. There's only so much that they can ask, and that's probably some of the reasons why they don't piss off Russia so much. Um, Believe me, if they could have it their way, Russia would not be in Syria, and Syria would be like Libya. Um, but they can't afford to do that. So there has been a reversal of fortunes.
Look, I know it's been a bit of an exaggeration, but I think at the end of the day, you have to keep in mind that the most pure form of Zionist ideology is from the Tigris to the Nile, is what they, or is to the
Yes.
Euphrates to the Nile. Excuse me. But point being is that is still the pipe dream of a non-insignificant amount of Zionists. Now, you can
Oh
argue
yeah.
whether Netanyahu or Naftali Bennett or any of these people whether they actually believe in that. But point being is a significant amount of people both within and outside of Israel do hold to that. They do believe that the modern day Jewish people are entitled to all of that land. Now, again, that maybe that isn't always what affects practical policy, but it certainly is something that's always lingering on in the background.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, they're a deluded group. Um, that's not going to happen, um, and they know it now. I think many of them sense it.
Yes, which is why I think they're so desperate to keep the American empire in some sort of mental position because we've discussed this when it comes
Hmm.
to this group of people. Let's just call them let's just call them the Jewish people because that's what they are. No hate, no discrimination or anything, but I think it is true, and many of them will say this, that they do view America as something of a second promised land, especially among the secular Jews, that they believe in order for their interests, their personal interests, it is good to have a strong American empire. Whereas, that doesn't necessarily mutually exclusive of a support of a strong Israel, but I think at the end of the day, most of them will put stock in a strong American empire over a strong Zionist state.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, this is going to be, I think 2022 is going to be just the most pivotal year in so many decades.
Oh, absolutely. Again, this is the next 1919 or next 1945, and I will say that unequivocally, no exaggerations at all. That this
Yeah.
year will be paradigm shifting. This year will be remembered the same way we remember the conferences in 1919 and the way we remember the structuring of the post-war order in the late 1940s, because we are seeing a restructuring of the world order, and maybe we won't see any grand fireworks, maybe we won't see any major collapses, but point being is the dynamics of all the world powers has fundamentally changed from what it was under the so-called rules-based international order. The rules-based international order is a joke. Um, I do question how long the UN will continue to exist even as a symbolic organization, because it's been a symbolic organization for many years, not that it ever had any real power, but I would say ever since the beginning of the millennium has not held any power beyond being an international forum. I mean, it's going to get to a point. I mean, Putin hasn't showed up at the UN since 2015. I believe it's been a few years since Xi Jinping has also showed up as well. But every year you get less and less leaders of major countries showing up at the UN General Assembly. So it's going to be something that either become. I mean, if I had to predict something about the UN, I think it would become something of a club of Western nations, aka the American Empire and her vassals.
Right. And it's kind of like that it's part of that leftward creep, and it's part of that false liberal notion of neutrality, right? It was, at the height of the Cold War, definitely sold as this neutral place that you could count on. It was, magnanimous with but I think after the fall of the Soviet Union, you notice the EU dramatically changed, and America basically scoffed at a lot of things afterwards, but so did a lot of other countries. And the UN just had bigger, had a much bigger role. Right now, it's just a soundstage for you know, various countries.
Or
Uh,
interest groups.
I,
I'm sure you'll remember they'll bring up again. They have their human rights organization. They have their women's rights, the LGBTQIA rights. Again, they'll bring up all these professional activists to come speak in front of the UN. Where
yeah,
again, it's not taken seriously. It is funny because something I actually do happen to align with hardline Zionists on is my disdain for the UN, and of course they'll point out how many resolutions have been drafted against Israel, how many resolutions have been passed against Israel, as if that's affected their standing in any way. And it's
yeah,
funny because they want to walk this line between like hardline nationalism and irredentism. It's hardline nationalism and irredentism for me, liberal nationalism for thee. That's pretty much what the UN is, at least from a hardline Zionist perspective. Where
yeah. It's basically American policy, right? It's a
yeah,
false neutral.
it's
Yeah.
again, it's where Western leaders can get up and pontificate about how we need a liberal-based international order while excusing their, let's just say, less optical proxies in order to get done what needs to be done.
Right. And so when you infiltrate like a former false neutral with your ideology, they become now the de facto new neutral. And that's why that's why Orban is considered far right. Like
Yes,
Orban is far right.
I think it's Robert Conquest. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong about talking about institutions. Like any institution that isn't explicitly right wing will drift leftward. Now, I believe that's true to an extent, just because of the way the
Yeah,
culture is. But I think it's like any institution that is neutral is liable to be taken over by anyone. It just happens that the
that's
left
right.
wing, at
That's
least
right.
in his time and even in our time, are the proactive ones insofar as that's concerned.
Yeah.
But that's all I had for this episode.
Yeah, me too.
So, thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. We will see you again whenever we do our next episode, which will probably be in a week, give or take. But I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and goodbye.
Take care.